Saraya Voss's eyes snapped open, heart racing. The cold steel of the chair against her back was an immediate, harsh reminder of her predicament. She inhaled deeply, the scent of blood, sweat, and oil lingering in the stale air. Her limbs were bound, but her mind was sharp, as always. She'd been captured. Her pulse quickened, a rush of adrenaline feeding the rage that burned in her chest. The deep, guttural voice of an alien echoed across the dimly lit room, a language she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, hostile, impatient. Heavy footsteps approached, and a shadow loomed before her. Human, the alien rasped, his face a grotesque mix of scales and teeth. Zelak, the leader of the Ruthari mercenaries who had taken her ship. His reptilian eyes gleamed with malice, his fangs sharp as he towered over her. The sight only fueled her defiance. She glared up at him. "What do you want?" He chuckled darkly. "You will answer my questions. You have no choice." His voice dropped to a growl. "Where are your reinforcements? Where is the fleet?" Saraya's lips curled into a thin smile. Her wrists ached from the restraints, but she showed no sign of fear. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice low and steady. "You'll get nothing from me." Zalak leaned closer, his reptilian scent heavy and nauseating. He reached out, gripping her chin with a clawed hand, forcing her to meet his piercing gaze. "I think you misunderstand, human. We don't ask questions. We take." Before she could respond, the sound of a door sliding open echoed through the room. Another mercenary entered, a hulking creature with jagged scales running down his back, carrying an array of crude weapons. He looked at Zelak and spoke in that harsh alien tongue. Zelak waved him off, his attention fixed on Saraya. His claws dug into her skin, making her wince slightly, though she kept her face neutral. "You'll speak eventually. I'll make sure of it." She opened her mouth to retort, but something in the mercenary's tone shifted. It was the slight tension in the air, a hint of unease that sent a chill down her spine. The other mercenary was staring at the corner of the room, his posture stiff. Zalak turned to follow his gaze. A low hum filled the air, subtle yet distinct. The floors seemed to vibrate beneath them, and for a split second, Saraya thought she could hear something far off, a distant transmission, too faint to make out. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice dripping with false innocence. Zalak shot her a quick, irritated glance. "Enough games. Focus, Voss." But the hum grew louder, reverberating in the metal walls. Her heart thudded in her chest, faster now. The ship seemed to tremble. Was it a malfunction? Or was something else happening? She'd been on enough covert missions to recognize the sound of a cloaked ship approaching. Zalak's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" Saraya let her lips curl into a small, knowing smile. "Your mistake." Before Zalak could respond, an eerie, metallic voice echoed through the room, coming from the mercenary's comlink. The transmission was fuzzy, but the words were unmistakable. "This is Widowmaker. Identify last known location of Operative Voss." The words hit Saraya like a cold wave. Widowmaker. The name alone was enough to send a shiver down any mercenary's spine. Zalak's expression faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Saraya to notice. She had no doubt they were aware of the reputation that name carried. Widowmaker. The human elite strike force, known for their cold efficiency and ruthless tactics. No survivors. Her grin widened. "It seems you've made a mistake, Zalak. You should have killed me when you had the chance." Zalak growled, stepping back, his claws clenching. "This is your doing," he hissed, fury in his voice. "You brought them here." Saraya tilted her head. "Do you really think I would warn you if I could? That was your decision. You thought you could break me, but you've just signed your death warrant." The mercenaries exchanged uncertain glances, and the tension in the room escalated. A low hum echoed again, louder this time. The lights flickered. A violent thud reverberated through the walls, followed by a series of loud cracks. Saraya could feel the ship shifting beneath her, as if some external force was starting to tear at it. A muffled scream echoed from outside the door. Zalak turned sharply. "What is happening?" The voice came again, this time clearer, more direct. Widowmaker. Target identified. Moving in. The ship groaned, and the flickering lights grew dim. Saraya's senses sharpened. She could feel the vibrations now, the slight changes in air pressure. The mercenaries were no longer in control, they had lost the advantage. She could already hear the soft thud of boots on metal, the unmistakable sound of soldiers moving through the ship with military precision. These were no ordinary humans, they were Widowmaker. Zalak was pacing now, his alien eyes wild with panic. "Prepare for battle," he roared, snapping orders to his subordinates. But even he knew, it was too late. The signal had been sent, and his fate had already been sealed. Saraya's lips barely parted as she whispered under her breath, "The end has come, Zalak." Suddenly, the door slammed open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the last thing Zalak ever expected to see. A human soldier, clad in black tactical armor, a pulse rifle slung across his chest. He was calm, unhurried, every step measured, every movement precise. And he wasn't alone. Several others, equally composed, filed in behind him, their weapons trained on the Ruthari mercenaries. Widowmaker had arrived. Saraya's smile deepened. "I hope you enjoy the view, Zalak. Because it's the last one you'll get." The mercenary leader's defiance crumbled as he faced the inevitable, human vengeance. The shrill sound of sirens echoed through the hull of the ship, as if the walls themselves screamed in fear. Zalak's reptilian eyes widened, his pupils constricting as the low, unrelenting hum vibrated through his bones. He had been through battles, endured sieges, and crushed entire civilizations, but this felt different. This felt inevitable. He shot a desperate glance at his crew. The mercenaries, once confident and unwavering, now fumbled with weapons, their fear palpable. The room reeked of tension, sweat, and panic. Saraya's hands were still bound, her body stiff, but her mind was racing. Every part of her was alert, the impending storm almost audible in the air. She didn't need to see the mercenaries to know they were already turning on each other, doubts eating at them like a slow-burning fire. One of the mercenaries, Kroth, a towering brute with gnarled fists, whispered something to Zalak in their alien tongue. Zalak didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could will it to stay shut. The cold sweat on his forehead spoke volumes. Even his fangs seemed less sharp, his posture less assured. "What did you say?" Saraya's voice cut through the tension. Her voice was quiet but biting, laced with the kind of confidence that only someone who had stared death in the face could muster. Kroth shot her a withering look, his breath thick with the stench of his fear. "We've heard of them," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for Saraya to catch. "Widowmaker." Zalak snarled, a growl low in his throat as he turned to face Kroth. "Enough," he barked. "We will deal with them in our own time. But we have." Saraya's lips twitched into a slight smile. "You think you can deal with them? The Widowmaker don't deal. They eliminate." The words hit harder than she intended. Zalak froze, his scales stiffening. In that moment, Saraya saw it, the fear. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. The Ruthari warlord was realizing, too late, that he had underestimated the human force he was about to face. Outside the door, the pounding had begun. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the sound of combat, it was the sound of a hunt. Zalak's voice came out in a rasp, barely a whisper. "You set this in motion, didn't you, Voss?" Saraya tilted her head, her restraints now the least of her worries. "If you call alerting the Widowmaker setting it in motion, then sure, I did." Her grin was full of dark humor. "Though, to be fair, I didn't have to. You made the mistake of taking me alive. They don't make those kinds of mistakes." Zalak's fury was building, but he held it in check, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for the rest of the crew to prepare, though his movements were less confident now. The alien leader's grip on control was slipping fast. But Saraya didn't need to see the panic in his eyes to know the truth. She could feel it in the vibrations of the ship, hear it in the growing intensity of the thuds outside the door. The Widowmaker was coming. The name alone was enough to send any mercenary into a state of quiet dread. She had seen it firsthand, the precision, the relentlessness. They were no ordinary human soldiers. They were ghosts, shadows, legends. And when they were dispatched, it was never to negotiate. They simply erased all obstacles. It wasn't long before another transmission crackled through the comm system, cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "This is Widowmaker. Operative Voss located. Engaging hostile forces. Omega Protocol in effect." Zalak's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "No. No." He turned to one of his officers. "Shut it off. Now." But it was too late. The ship's auxiliary systems powered down in response to the incoming assault. The lights flickered, casting the room in eerie shadows. The air pressure shifted slightly, signaling that something massive was outside the ship's hull. "Widowmaker," Croth repeated under his breath, his voice a rasp. "We're all going to die." Saraya leaned back in her chair, no longer struggling against the restraints. Her smile was cold, resigned. "You didn't understand, did you, Zalak? You thought you were capturing a prisoner. But you just triggered a mass extinction event." Zalak didn't respond. His gaze was now fixed on the door, as though he could command the situation to resolve itself through sheer force of will. But the ship continued to tremble. Thud. The door buckled. It wasn't a blast. It wasn't a strike. It was more like the ship was being pulled apart from the outside, and the force was coming for them. Zalak's eyes widened. "No, no," he barked again, now moving frantically to the nearest console. The other mercenaries were scrambling, some too scared to even properly arm themselves. They were realizing, too late, that this was no ordinary mission. This was a death sentence. "Everyone, prepare for combat." Zalak yelled, though the words were hollow, drained of his usual venom. His soldiers were already backing away, their fear evident in every quick, panicked movement. Saraya, despite the situation, couldn't help but find a strange satisfaction in it. Zalak, the great warlord, was crumbling under the pressure. His ruthless crew was nothing more than a collection of trembling bodies, hoping for survival. But survival wasn't a luxury for them. Not today. She shifted in her seat, her restraints already loosened from the sudden tension. "It's over," she murmured, almost to herself. The door blasted open. The Widowmaker team poured into the room. Silent, efficient, deadly. They wore tactical armor that absorbed the dim light, blending into the shadows with effortless grace. Their weapons, sleek and precise, were trained on every living target in the room. Not a single shot was fired yet. They didn't need to. Not with mercenaries scattered like cockroaches. Saraya Voss, one of them spoke, his voice a soft, controlled whisper. He had no helmet, just a face that was as cold as the void itself. Saraya stood up slowly, her hands still bound. Her voice was filled with a strange sense of finality. "I'm ready for extraction." Behind her, the Ruthari mercenaries froze. The room was now suffused with an eerie stillness. The hunt had ended. The humans had arrived. And Zalak, for the first time, realized just how little control he had left. The tension in the air was suffocating. Saraya stood in the heart of the room, her wrists still bound, but she felt no fear. The cold, methodical advance of the Widowmaker team was the only thing that mattered now. They had come to finish what the Ruthari had started. The leader of the Widowmaker team, a tall figure clad in dark tactical armor, moved into the room with the silence of a predator. His face was an unreadable mask, but his eyes, sharp, focused, unwavering, told a different story. He was the one who would bring justice to Saraya's captors. The last of the Ruthari mercenaries, their weapons raised but trembling, looked toward their leader for guidance. Zalak's face was an ugly mixture of rage and fear, his jagged claws flexing as he took an unsteady step forward. "No one leaves here alive," Zalak spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Not even you, human." The leader of Widowmaker, his expression unwavering, lifted a hand. The rest of his team remained perfectly still, their weapons still poised, but their movements were deliberate, controlled. They were not in a hurry. They knew the outcome was inevitable. Saraya Vos, the Widowmaker operative said, his voice smooth and calm. We are here for your extraction. A sharp grin spread across Saraya's face as she locked eyes with Zelak. You're wasting your time, Zelak, she said. They don't negotiate. They don't spare anyone. Zelak's throat tightened. His mercenaries were already starting to scatter, retreating into the corners of the room like frightened animals. The Ruth Ari leader, once a towering force of fear, now seemed like a cornered rat. His bluster had vanished. The reality of the situation had settled in. Fight, Zelak, Saraya taunted, her voice thick with satisfaction. It's over. The first gunshot rang out, followed by a cacophony of controlled chaos. The Widowmaker operative in the center raised his weapon, the familiar crack of a suppressed rifle cutting through the silence. One of the Ruth Ari mercenaries dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the floor, the life drained from him in an instant. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Saraya stood still as the chaos unfolded around her. The Widowmaker team moved like shadows, their coordinated actions fluid and precise. The Ruth Ari mercenaries, once confident and brutal, were reduced to nothing more than prey. They had no chance. They never had. The room smelled of burning plasma, the sharp tang of ozone filling the air as Widowmaker's weapons cut through the Ruthari's defenses. Saraya's gaze swept over the battlefield, watching as one by one, the mercenaries fell. None of them had the skill, the coordination, or the instinct to survive against such an onslaught. Zelak roared, rage and panic swelling inside him. He swung his massive sword, aiming at the nearest Widowmaker operative, but his strike was nothing more than a wild, desperate lunge. It missed by a mile. One of the Widowmaker team, a smaller figure with quick reflexes, dodged the strike effortlessly and shot him in the shoulder with a single, well-placed shot. Zelak grunted, stumbling back as the searing pain from his wound flared to life. His eyes widened with disbelief, his hands clutching at the gaping hole in his armor. But even as his blood spilled onto the floor, he didn't give up. He took another step forward, his teeth bared, determined to fight until his last breath. You will not survive this, human, he snarled at the Widowmaker leader, his voice hoarse. I will see you burn for this. The leader of Widowmaker, still calm, looked at Zelak as if he were a nuisance, a fleeting disturbance in a game that was already won. Without a word, he raised his rifle and fired, the bullet tearing through Zelak's skull with a clean, unceremonious shot. Zelak's body hit the floor with a heavy thud, the once proud leader of the Ruth Ari mercenaries now nothing more than a carcass on the cold, metal floor. His reign of terror had ended. The room went quiet. The hum of the ship's systems, the only sound now, filled the space, and Saraya felt a strange stillness settle in her chest. The danger was over. Widowmaker had secured the room. The mercenaries were no more. Saraya allowed herself a moment of relief, though it was brief. She had been freed, but the war wasn't over. It never would be. One of the Widowmaker operatives, she couldn't make out the name on his helmet, approached her, his movements smooth and controlled. He didn't need to ask if she was all right. His calm assessment of the room told him everything he needed to know. He was the sort of soldier who didn't waste words. He reached down, his gloved hand wrapping around the restraints that still bound Saraya's wrists. She didn't resist as he released her, her muscles stiff from the long hours of captivity. She rubbed her wrists, wincing slightly at the soreness, but her eyes never left the team of operatives around her. You're free, Vos, the operative said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. We've got a ship waiting. Saraya nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I never doubted you would come, she replied. I knew you would come for me. Her gaze flicked to the bodies of the Ruth Ari mercenaries, their lifeless forms littering the room. The operative's helmet tilted slightly, the faintest sign of acknowledgement in his movements. But there was no time for pleasantries. Widowmaker didn't waste time with sentiment. Let's go. Saraya followed the team out of the room, her steps light, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline. They moved quickly, efficiently, through the corridors of the Ruth Ari ship, their weapons at the ready, ever vigilant for any remaining threats. But there was no one left to challenge them. As they approached the docking bay, the lights flickered. The ship's systems were still unstable from the damage caused by the Widowmaker team's assault, but there was no stopping them now. The sleek, dark silhouette of the Widowmaker ship awaited, hovering silently, ready for departure. Saraya's heart thrummed with anticipation. She was free. But the mission wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. The hatch to the ship opened, and the Widowmaker team filed inside, their movements sharp and efficient. Saraya stepped forward, her mind already shifting to the next phase of the mission. She had to stay focused. She had to stay sharp. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed in the silence. And as the ship's engines hummed to life, Saraya knew that the Ruthari mercenaries were just the beginning. The Widowmaker ship hummed steadily as it soared through the void, cutting through the silence of deep space. The rhythmic thrum of the engines was the only sound in the ship's tight, sterile interior, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Saraya Voss stood at the observation window, her hands resting lightly on the cold, smooth glass. The blackness of space stretched out before her, punctuated by distant stars and the faint glimmer of shattered ships. Her heart had barely slowed from the rush of adrenaline that had surged through her during the battle. She was still trying to catch her breath, even though she was far from the fray now. Behind her, the sound of boots clanking against the metal floor grew louder, and she didn't need to turn to know who was approaching. She'd recognized his footsteps long before. "How are you holding up?" The voice was calm, controlled, the same one that had spoken to her before, always measured. Saraya finally turned to face him. The Widowmaker operative was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh lighting of the hallway. His face was still hidden beneath his helmet, his posture rigid and stoic. But there was something in his stance, a faint slant of his shoulders, that told her he was more than just a soldier. "I'm fine," Saraya said, her voice sharp and clear. "More than fine." Her eyes flickered to the crew around her, the Widowmaker team, still scanning their surroundings, ensuring their safety. The operative nodded, the faintest hint of approval flickering in his eyes before he spoke again. "The mission isn't over." Her lips curled slightly, and she nodded. "I know." She had expected that. It wasn't over, nothing ever was. The fight against the Ruthari had only been the beginning. The real challenge loomed on the horizon, and Saraya was ready. She wasn't going to rest until the job was done, until every last trace of the alien threat had been eradicated. The operative stepped forward, his movements precise and deliberate. He placed a small data pad in her hands, his fingers brushing against hers for a moment. "We're moving to the next phase." Saraya glanced at the screen, her eyes scanning the mission parameters. The data was cold, clinical, and straightforward, a new target, a new assignment. Another Ruthari stronghold, one more piece of the puzzle to dismantle. The objectives were clear. The threat was clear. And Saraya was ready to meet it head-on. "We've intercepted a high-priority signal from the Ruthari command." The operative's voice was almost mechanical, the emotion stripped away, his tone all business. "They're calling for reinforcements. They think we're still a weak force." He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of that statement sink in. "It's our opportunity." Saraya's eyes narrowed. Reinforcements. She could feel the tension building, the quiet hum of anticipation in the air. The Ruthari had no idea what they were up against. They were underestimating humanity, and that mistake would cost them. Her jaw clenched as she read the final line on the datapad. "We're going to hit them before they can mobilize." The operative didn't respond immediately. He knew she didn't need to be told what was coming next. It wasn't a question of if they would succeed, it was a question of how fast they could eradicate the Ruthari threat. "When do we leave?" Saraya asked, her voice a low murmur. "In an hour." The operative's eyes met hers briefly before he turned to leave, his voice low but decisive. "Get ready, Voss. The hunt begins again." Saraya watched him leave, her mind already shifting into gear. She had fought before, had faced worse odds and come out victorious. But this felt different. The stakes were higher, the enemies more cunning. She could feel the weight of the mission pressing against her chest, but she knew one thing for sure: there was no going back. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Saraya suited up, donning her combat armor with practiced precision. Each piece slid into place with a familiar weight, a comfort in the midst of chaos. She adjusted the straps, checked the seals, and loaded her weapons. Her mind was clear, focused. She had one goal: to destroy the Ruthari stronghold and cut off the reinforcements before they had a chance to regroup. The Widowmaker team was already assembled, waiting in the docking bay. They were silent, their expressions unreadable, each one locked in their own thoughts, mentally preparing for the operation. Saraya could sense the anticipation in the air, the quiet hum of soldiers ready to spring into action. She approached the team leader, her footsteps silent on the metal floor. He turned to face her, his helmet now off, revealing a chiseled face with sharp, calculating eyes. He didn't smile, didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. Saraya nodded at him, her face hardening. Ready to move. Without a word, the team leader gave a brief nod. He turned to the others, issuing commands in a low, clipped tone. The team moved into formation, fluid and synchronized. No one hesitated. No one wavered. All units, prepare for deployment. The team leader's voice rang out in the silence. The ship's ramp lowered with a deep rumble, revealing the vast expanse of the Ruthari's desolate moon base. The atmosphere was thick, a hazy red glow casting everything in an eerie light. The place reeked of war, of preparation. Saraya's gut twisted. The Ruthari were digging in, expecting reinforcements. They would never see the human assault coming. Saraya's pulse quickened as the ramp hit the ground with a solid thud. The team surged forward, weapons raised, their movements coordinated like a well-oiled machine. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and the faint scent of ozone as they deployed into the hostile environment. Saraya was in the lead, her boots crunching against the rocky surface. The first wave of fire came from the enemy, distant shots that only served to signal the inevitable. The Ruthari had seen them coming, but they were too late. The team returned fire with unerring accuracy, each shot landing with deadly precision. The battle was over before it even began. The Ruthari were crushed beneath the weight of Widowmaker's assault. Their defenses were no match for the human precision, their lines falling apart as the Widowmaker team advanced relentlessly. The sky above them was alive with flashes of light, explosions that rippled across the battlefield, tearing through the enemy's fortifications. Saraya moved with the team, her rifle steady in her hands as she picked off enemy targets one by one. Her heart raced, but there was no hesitation in her movements. She had been trained for this. She had lived for this. And the Ruthari, desperate, broken, and fractured, stood no chance.